KrisAnne Hall is a constitutional attorney. She's a former state prosecutor who was fired for teaching the Constitution at Tea Party rallies. She's a disabled vet of the Army. She's a Russian linguist, a mom, a pastor's wife, an author, a patriot, and one of my dear friends. She travels the country teaching the history of our founding documents, and it is an amazing presentation. I'd like to introduce to you KrisAnne Hall. Y'all won't mind if I detach myself from this podium, will you? Because I don't stand behind things very well. I think it's dangerous. If I could just give a little, I don't know, it's not an endorsement because I don't endorse candidates. But if you happen to have a chance to go and see Marielena Stewart, I would suggest that you do that.
Yeah, thank you.
Even if just to hear where her passion comes from. She knows what communism is about from a first-hand perspective. And she knows what she's looking at when she sees it. So she is a very strong, well-educated woman who loves this country, not because she was born here, because she had to fight to get here. And so I think just hearing her story is enough to make you want to go and listen to her. And then when you listen to her, make your decision on what you want to do. Because I'm sure Karina would agree with me when I tell you, if we are going to do anything right by this country, we have got to really, really have a revolution of the mind and shed this idea that we can only vote for people who some people determine to be electable. Because let me ask you a very important question. And I think I know the answer because I'm usually preaching to the choir. Do you believe that we are a government of the people, by the people, for the people? Then we are the ones who should be deciding who is electable and who is not. And the grassroots movement is successful because $20 from every person who believes this nation is great and should remain that way is more money than any large group of donors will ever provide to any establishment candidate. Because the power began with the people and it remains with the people, and we have a responsibility to keep it that way. You know, I'm just, I too am rather touched at the loss of Andrew Breitbart. He and I, apparently, I did not know this, I'm sure I could have guessed it, share a passion. I like making enemies too. Because I've come to the conclusion, and we have a daughter, she'll be 20 this month, she's in college, and now we have my son, our son who is 5, and we've taught them both that you are who you roll with. You are who your friends are. But I also like to say you can also classify yourself very well by who your enemies are. Right? If God be for us, who can be against us? And if you're against us and God is for us, then that just tells me whose side you're on. Amen. But this revolution of a mind must really begin with us. We are the ones that have to start focusing on the disease instead of trying to put Band-Aids on the symptoms. That's what we do. We have become a nation built on dependence. The American dream used to be something that meant that you could come to this nation and the only thing that would limit you was your own ideas and the ability you had to put in hard work and sweat equity to make your dreams a reality. You see, the American dream used to be based on self-reliance, but now it's based on dependence. What can the government give for me? What can the government do for me? And it has infected our nation to the business level so that now we can reasonably discuss public-private partnerships, which are fascism. Okay? There's no other way to define that but fascism. And if we are really going to turn this around, if we're really going to make a difference, we are the ones that have to learn the definitions of these terms. We are the ones that have to know that public-private partnerships are fascism and not the Republican-style government this nation was built on. We must understand that we are a republic, not a democracy. We must understand that the people that we elect are not officials, other than that they officially work for us. And simply because you are elected does not make you a leader. Your character, your integrity, that is what makes you a leader. So we need to start correcting the way we speak about things. We have to learn the meanings of these words. And one of the most important words that we have completely lost the meaning of is liberty. Just ask any Occupy fill in the city, and they'll simply not even be able to tell you what liberty is. But the fundamental truth is that our founding fathers were focused on liberty. There's a lot of misconception that goes around when you talk about our founding fathers, and I believe that most of it revolves around this underlying desire to dilute the importance and the strength of our Constitution. Because that is what protects our rights. Recently someone corrected me, and I stand corrected. These are not constitutional rights. These are rights protected by the Constitution, secured by the Constitution, but they are rights that are inherently belonging to the people. And the government has no business in them other than to secure them for us and for our children.
They pre-existed the Constitution.
Absolutely, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. You see, John Adams in 1765 said we must protect liberty at all hazards. 1765. Liberty must be protected at all hazards. Okay, he said liberty. Not healthcare, okay? Not your auto industry, not your banking system, not the Federal Reserve, not your pocketbook or your public school system. But liberty must be protected at all hazards. They were focused on liberty. He said, we have a right to it derived from our Maker. How many of you have heard of a philosophy called natural law? That means you probably heard of a man named John Locke, right? Okay. John Locke did not invent natural law. Natural law, according to its own principles, was invented in the garden when God breathed life into man. What it says is, we are created in the image of God. And because we are created in the image of God, we've inherited certain traits from God. Like we are biologically, physically created in the image of our parents. My hair color and my eye color, they come from my father. And ladies, you can probably join me here. The older I get, the more I look in the mirror, the more I see my mother. Right? Gentlemen, you don't see your mothers, you see your fathers, right? I see his father. The older he gets, so. That's my husband, by the way. He is my strength and my support. I could not do this without him. But that's what we mean by being created in the image of God. We've inherited certain things. God is the most ultimate free being in the universe. Nobody can tell God how to do things. You see, but we've inherited that freedom by the nature of our creation. We don't have the power that God has to do those things, but we have that freedom to do those things. The unfortunate thing is that we get confused. about that, especially these Occupy people, because remember John Adams said liberty must be protected at all hazards. He did not say freedom, because liberty and freedom are not synonymous. You see, we don't want to live in a world that is completely free. You don't want a free, totally free nation. Because if we are totally free, that means I'm free to murder, I'm free to lie, I'm free to steal, I'm free to do whatever is right in my own mind, regardless of how that affects you. Sort of sounds like Congress, doesn't it? Just kidding. No. Okay. But listen, liberty and freedom are not synonymous. And God knew that we could not handle that freedom. So in this principle of natural law, we have to understand, God, knowing we could not handle that type of freedom, gave us law. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not lie. Thou shalt not murder. Does everybody sound familiar to everybody? Okay. Morality. Liberty is freedom and morality. Because only when you have a moral center can you handle the freedom that you've been given by God. Now, we cannot build a nation on moral law alone. Moral law, not sprinkled with freedom, is theocracy. And theocracy in the hands of men is tyranny. And that is precisely why Sharia law has no place in a constitutional republic. But see, John Adams said this in 1765, liberty must be protected at all hazards. We have a right to it, derived from our Maker. He's talking to a large group of people in a document called the Dissertation on Feudal and Canon Law. And I think maybe he feels like it's of such a large group that maybe not everybody believes natural law. So he continues by saying, but if we had not, in other words, if we hadn't gotten this gift from God, okay? But if we had not, our fathers have purchased it for us with their ease, their estates, and their blood. He's saying if you don't believe that God gave us liberty, you cannot deny that men and women have died so that we can have it today. And I imagine there's many of you here that join me in believing both of those things. That because liberty is a gift from God, men and women have had no problem dying so that we could have it today. But the date, who remembers what date John Adams said that? Quick pop quiz. You guys didn't know you were going to have pop quizzes, did you? 1765. You're officially not allowed to answer these questions. That was 11 years before the Declaration of Independence, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So what was John Adams saying? He said, our fathers. He's saying, my name's John Adams, and my fathers have purchased liberty for me. So you see, our founding fathers didn't invent liberty.
Right.
They didn't even invent the principles that went into the Constitution. But how many of you have heard this idea that the Constitution is a living, breathing document?
Yeah, we heard of it.
You don't have to believe it. Okay, you've heard it, right?
Yeah.
The problem is, even though we don't believe it to be true, very few people in society can actually tell you why it's not true. And some, even in our conservative circles, will believe it's not true, but will also believe that it's just another way, somebody else's opinion, and somehow interpretation of the Constitution should be left to opinion. But this is what I hope to give you today. I hope to give you a lot more than this. But basically, what I want you to know is how to tell someone why the Constitution is not a living, breathing document. See, there's several principles that must be true for the Constitution to be a living, breathing document. Now, what that means is that the words in the Constitution mean what they want, what we want them to mean, based on what we have today. The understanding that our founding fathers could not have possibly known that we were going to have iPads and the internet and cell phones and cars and airplanes and nuclear bombs. Therefore, the document they wrote, as Justice Ginsburg will tell us, was written so long ago by a bunch of bigoted wife haters that it can't possibly be worth anything today. But you see, that's not true, because our Constitution is not based on circumstances. Our Constitution is built on principles. And by the very definition of the word principle, they do not change. They are eternal. The other thing that you have to believe, if you believe a living, breathing document theory, is that our founding fathers had no idea what they were doing. One man said they were winging it. Okay? And even those liberals will like to quote our founding fathers, because anytime you pick up the Federalist Papers or the Anti-Federalist Papers, you will hear our founding fathers say that they were engaged in a great Republican experiment, the grand governmental experiment. And they'll quote them, but they'll misuse that word experiment. You see, they want you to believe that an experiment is taking a little bit of this thing over here, we're not quite sure what it is, and a little bit of this thing over here, we're not quite sure what it is. And you know what? Hey, they sound really good. Let's throw them together and see what happens. See, what Karina didn't tell you is that my undergraduate degree is in biochemistry. And I spent just a little bit of time in a laboratory. And if you take, in a laboratory, a little bit of this, something you know nothing about, and a little bit of this, and something you know anything about, and throw them together, that's not an experiment, that's an explosion. You see, our founding fathers knew the real definition of that word experiment meant you take something here that you know absolutely everything that you can possibly know about it, and you take something here which you know absolutely everything you can know about it, and before you even think about putting them together, you do all the calculations and you work through all your hypotheses on paper and on the computer to make sure when you put them together you don't have an explosion, unless of course that's what you're looking to do. And then and only then do you put these things together to prove what you believe you know will already happen. And that's what our founding fathers did. Our founding fathers were students of human nature and scholars of history. And they applied those two things together to try to protect us from making the same mistakes that their fathers did. Patrick Henry said, "I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know no way to judge the future, but by the past." Alexander Hamilton said that experience is the oracle of truth, and where its responses are unequivocal, they ought to be held to be sacred. Our founding fathers were telling us they didn't need a crystal ball. They didn't need to guess. They didn't need to find a psychic medium. They didn't need a message from God in the form of a burning bush. What they had was their past and a wisdom, I do believe, as a gift from God, to know what our future was going to look like, because there is nothing new under the sun, and human nature never changes. And so when we think about John Adams' fathers, what I'd like to do is take you back to 1041 England. Because in 1041, the king had made an agreement with the people, just sort of, not really binding on the king, but just an agreement that they would get together with their barons and lords. The empire was broken up into shires. That's where we get the word sheriff from, because it was like counties, the sheriffs. And twice a year, they would meet with the barons and the lords, and they would, in a pre-designated place, and they would tell him what they liked and what they didn't like about the way the kingdom was running. And the idea was that the barons and lords would go to the king and tell him what they heard, and of course the king would do whatever he wanted. because he's the king. What does he care what the people think? But I guess kings, if they want to keep their heads, they have to keep the people somewhat happy. So in 1066, the King of England is on his deathbed and he does not have an heir to the throne. So he tries to replace his rule with his second in command by the name of Harold. Harold did not have a blood right to the throne, but the people of England liked him, and so did the current king. The problem was, the king's son is not the only person who has the right to the throne, right? Because you are not king because you're appointed or elected. You're king because you have a bloodline that guarantees you that God-given divine right, is what they called it. And there was a man with that right, and his name was William I. William I was the king of ruler of Normandy, but he was also called William the Conqueror, and he did just that. He got his Norman army and went over to England and conquered Harold and the English army and set himself up on the throne. And what do you suppose William I did as soon as he got to England? He started replacing the judges in the courtrooms with judges that were loyal to him. So why? So that he could enforce his foreign law on the people. Well, you don't maintain a rule like that unless you have plenty of friends in the country with you. So he starts chasing the English landowners off their land with threat and with violence itself, and then handing the land over to his foreign friends. He starts inserting himself into the church and then their religious liberty and taxing them through arbitrary taxations. William I is on his deathbed. He has 4 born sons. His firstborn was killed in a hunting accident. He and his secondborn get into an argument just before he dies. And his son runs off to fight in the Crusades, leaving his 2 sons, William II and Henry I, as heirs to the throne. Well, William I dies, and William II is king. And William II and Henry I go hunting. And William II is killed in a mysterious hunting accident. Now the people of England laughed, and probably not out of amusement, but out of disgust, because they didn't believe that it was an accident either. So there was a grand tribunal called, a great investigation, but the government in the realm found that Henry was not at fault. But think about it, if Henry had been at fault, they'd have been in the same situation they were in 1066, right? With no heir to the throne and right for the conqueror. So Henry had to do something to please the people because he was not their favorite. And he makes 2 concessions. He marries an Anglo-Saxon woman, which is a great part of the empire, gives them representation on the throne, satisfies that piece of the empire. But the second thing that he did, which is most important to us, is he signed the 1100 Charter of Liberties. You see, this was now a written promise from the king, bearing his seal as testimony to his word that he would not be evil and oppressive. Can you imagine a king promising these people that they wouldn't be evil and oppressive? I mean, that has to admit that his father was, right? He's just going to stop doing it. Well, listen to this. I, Henry, by the grace of God, having been crowned King of England. I think that's Henry's way of saying, thank you, God, for stray arrows. Will end all evil practices that have been oppressive presence in England. What's all mean? All, right? He says, I'm gonna stop it all. Everything that's an oppressive presence in England. Well, what's interesting is not only the promise that the king was making, recognizing that kings can be evil and oppressive, and maybe even further recognizing that people deserve to be treated better than that, was what was evil and oppressive in 1100 England. If any baron or earl of mine shall die, his heirs shall not be forced to purchase their inheritance, but shall retrieve it through force of law and custom. In 1100 England, inheritance tax was evil and oppressive. Isn't that what that is? Purchasing your inheritance from the government? If any of my baron commit a crime, he shall not bind himself to the crown as with a payment, as was done in the time of my father and brother, but shall stand for the crime as was custom and law, and make amends as are appropriate. In 1100 England, it was considered evil and oppressive for the men who made the laws to consider themselves above the law. Don't you wish Eric Holder had a little piece of that? I watched those hearings, the Fast and Furious hearings, and I can tell you, with almost 9 years' experience as a prosecutor, if they had that kind of evidence against me, I would not be getting a finger wagging from Daryl Issa. I would be under a federal prison.
Yes.
But here we are in 1100 England, and that was evil and oppressive. Well, before you think that we were better off in 1100 than we are today, rest assured Henry didn't believe a word he was saying. He was just appeasing the people to get the throne. But he could never get away from the promise, and neither could the kings that followed him. So when the most evil king that England has ever known, even to this day, is on the throne, his name is John, and he is the most ruthless king ever. And it's not because he was the king that started income tax, because he was, but that's not why he was ruthless. It's what he did to the people when they could not pay their taxes. His taxation was so oppressive that he was literally taxing the people to death. And when they could not, they had absolutely nothing to pay, he would arrest them, mutilate them, and execute them. The people of England said hell was fouled by the presence of John. You know John because you know Robin Hood. That's King John. What's Robin Hood's claim to fame? Rob from the rich and give to the poor, right? But you know what? That just should show you how deeply ingrained our socialist manipulation is. Because Robin Hood was not engaged in a grand utopian socialist experiment of redistribution of wealth. Robin Hood, in the truth of the legend, stole from the king and his agents, giving back the tax money that had been stolen from the people so they could literally live to see another day. Pretty interesting how deep that manipulation goes, isn't it? Well, John could not get away from the fact that Henry had made a promise to not be evil and oppressive. So when, get this is really interesting for us from a contemporary purpose, John refuses to recognize who the people choose to be their archbishop. The people chose Stephen Langton to be their archbishop, and John said, "Nope, I simply will not recognize that." Can you imagine a government trying to tell a church how they're supposed to run their business? Stephen Langton and the barons and the lords organized the people together to revolt against John, and they made a committee of 25 men. In their second committee meeting, with the 1100 Charter of Liberties in hand, they wrote a document that they would take to John at the point of a sword. This document is called the Magna Carta. Many of your constitutional historical lessons will begin with the Magna Carta, but I think you miss a very valuable point in this story, because the Magna Carta does not exist by itself. You see, the 1100 Charter of Liberties was the promise from the king that he would not be evil and oppressive. But the Magna Carta is saying to the king, you made this promise and you're not keeping it. So we're going to figure you don't know how to keep it. So we've drafted this Magna Carta to give you specific guidelines on what you can and cannot do in order to fulfill your promise to not be evil and oppressive. You see, they didn't even invent the Magna Carta. But the Magna Carta said that there'd be no taxation without representation. What representation would that be, by the way? Well, the Magna Carta created a committee of 25 men, common-born men that could tell the king no. Can you imagine that? Common men telling a man placed on a throne by God and divine right no? You have to know that did not go over well. Well, John signed it because he had a sword at his throat. Not because he wanted to. And he didn't believe any of it. But certain rights were established now because this was another document signed as a promise from the king. The right to no taxation without representation. The right to have representatives. The right to habeas corpus and right to a trial by jury all exist in our Magna Carta. Our 5th, 6th, and 7th Amendments are rooted before 1215 England. And so what happens then is now the people are starting to understand that this liberty thing is something that belongs to them, but it's just not maintained automatically. So we're just going to sort of fast forward a little bit so you guys don't have to go through the entire English history to about 1628, okay? Because kings have come and kings have gone, queens have come and gone, and now we have Charles I on the throne. Charles is interesting because Charles is a guy who likes to spend money. Okay? They said he was just romping about Europe, increasing debt on the crown on every whim. And who pays the debt of the crown? How do they pay the debt of the crown? Right. Well, doesn't the Magna Carta say that there'll be no taxation without representation? And so when Parliament now gets tired of passing taxes to pay for Charles's whims, and they start telling Charles no, what do you suppose the king does? Sends them home. Fine, if you don't want to run the government the way I think it needs to be run, I don't need you. We'll run it without you. And so the people had to rise against Charles and draft a list of grievances called the Petition of Right of 1628. Now remember, the 1100 Charter of Liberties is the promise from the king to not be evil and oppressive. The Magna Carta is the guidelines on what he can and cannot do to fulfill that promise. The Petition of Right of 1628 is how he's violating those conditions. Taxation without representation, martial law in time of peace, quartering soldiers, removing their right to habeas corpus, all of these things driving the people of England to revolution. One very important thing happens in this Petition of Right, and it's so small, I think that even Charles, well, I know that Charles missed it, but I think many will. It's actually one of the last sentences in the preamble that declares that liberty is an inherent right of man. It makes the king promise that he understands that liberty is not something that the government controls or possesses and hands out, but it's something that is a treasured possession of man. Charles signs the Petition of Right of 1628 by sword, so he doesn't believe it any more than John did or any more than Henry did. The problem is the people now get it. They're realizing this principle of eternal vigilance, that you must always have your hands guarded on your liberty because there is always someone who wants to take it away. And when Charles starts acting in the same way he did before the Petition of Rights and trying to pass these taxation laws, Parliament stands up again and says no. So guess what Charles does? Sends them home again. Now he did learn one thing. He learned that he could not pass taxes without Parliament. So he still had to recoup his debt. Guess what he did? He passed a law called forced loans. They're not taxes, they're forced loans. And so when 8 knights refused to pay their forced loans, they were arrested and placed in prison. And when they petitioned the judge, because remember they have a right to habeas corpus, when they petitioned the judge for their right to habeas corpus to be brought to trial to plead their case, something very interesting happened. They were brought before the judge, and it went something like this. Well, I see these knights in front of me, but there are no formal charges against them. What are we to do? Well, because there are no formal charges against them, we can only suppose that the crimes they have committed are so heinous and so egregious that we cannot inform the public of their crimes, and therefore they do not deserve a day in trial, and we will hold them indefinitely. Many of them died in prison. Because, prison wasn't your little socialist vacation club like it is today, right? Disease and illness and starvation. Well, this brought about the next revolution against Charles I and the next list of grievances called the Grand Remonstrance of 1641. This Grand Remonstrance was yet another document listing how Charles I had once again violated the provisions of the Magna Carta. How many of you have heard of Sustainable Development, Agenda 21? Would you be surprised to know that the UN did not invent that? Charles I was engaged in sustainable development. Read the Grand Remonstrance. He was taking by force and order of law private land from the people to create preservation zones. And then arresting and mutilating and executing anyone found hunting on those preserved lands. He was taking them off the gold and silver standard and creating brass fiat money. Do you believe me now that there's nothing new under the sun? Well, listen to this Grand Remonstrance. The root of all this mischief we find to be a malignant and pernicious design of subverting the fundamental laws and principles of government upon which the religion and justice of this kingdom are firmly established. That is probably one of the richest statements that I'll read to you today, other than John Adams' inaugural address. There are so many things in there. The root of all this mischief we find to be a malignant and pernicious design intended to subvert fundamental principles firmly established. Now, as an attorney, as a former linguist, my dictionary is one of my best used tools. I like to look up words, especially ones we don't use very much anymore, like subvert. So I looked up that word subvert, and it means to overturn and undermine. So they're saying what Charles was doing was overturning and undermining the fundamental laws of liberty that were firmly established. And then I thought, firmly established? This is 1641. How do they have anything firmly established? They don't have CNN or MSNBC or Fox to let them know what's going on. They don't have Rush or Hannity or Beck to tell them when the king's gone nuts. They don't have the internet. Everything that I told you, you can find on the internet like that. How did they have anything firmly established? But before I could really answer that question in my little historical journey, conviction set in on me. Because I'm just recently awakening to all of this. See, I'm a recovering liberal. Thank you. I spent way too much time in college. And if you don't go into college as a conservative, you're not coming out as one. Full-fledged tree hugger. You can ask my husband, he'll tell you. But one of the things that happened to me was I got a job. And I found out that I had to pay back those student loans, and the guy down the street who was still doing nothing was still getting my money. Then I had a family and realized that raising a family was a responsibility that belonged to me and not to the government. But let me proudly and boldly tell you my final conversion was a real one. When I accepted Christ as my Savior, I understood that my God was my provider and not government. So listen, what was one of the first things that they told us in the Grand Remonstrance? That this was a malignant and pernicious design. The people in 1641 were saying, hey, wait a minute, we're seeing a pattern here. These tyrants using the tools of tyranny are the same tools over and over and over again. Taxation, property rights, religious liberty, court, due process. Over and over and over again, the same tools. And I got to thinking, are we so smart? Are we so advanced that somehow there's no longer a design, that we're somehow immune to this design? No, that's not true. Because I think I found the key to our design. The very document that is drafted to secure the blessings of liberty for this nation and our posterity is what stands between liberty and tyranny. Yes. And you have to destroy that document so that the tools of tyranny can be used over and over again. And how do you do that? You steal the foundational history of that document and you make every single person believe that the Constitution was a document thrown together by a bunch of men who had no idea what they were doing. They were working on an agenda, creating a fundamentally flawed document. And we can believe that because we don't know about the glorious revolution of 1688. Now, some of you may have heard this presentation before or watched my DVDs, so you're not allowed to answer this question. But how many of you who have not heard me teach before have heard of the glorious revolution of 1688? Don't feel bad if you haven't, because I traveled the country, and in every group, less than a handful of people know of the glorious revolution of 1688. And without that bit of information, what you're saying now is, KrisAnne, this English history is very interesting. It's a whole lot better than I was taught in school, because it's now a lot more like real TV, because life is interesting and it's not real boring like we thought it was in school. But see, we're the melting pot, are we not? There are probably more people here not from England than are. But you see, that's irrelevant to our Constitution because our Constitution is English in history. Remember, what did John Adams say? Liberty must be protected at all hazards. We have a right to it derived from our Maker, but if we had not, our fathers had purchased it for us with their ease, their estates, and their blood. And this glorious revolution of 1688 is the next step in this line of progression from the 1100 Charter of Liberties, the 1628 Petition of Rights, the Grand Remonstrance of 1641, and now, because of the glorious revolution of 1688, we have the Bill of Rights of 1689. You see, I ask students when I go teach classrooms a little lesson on this, who fought in the Revolutionary War? And I always get the Americans and the British. Problem was there were no Americans. They were Americans by geography, not by nationality. They were proud British citizens. Proud British citizens that did not necessarily want to declare independence from the king. They liked being British, but the tyranny left them no choice. And they came to this continent with them very protections of their liberty sealed in the Bill of Rights of 1689. You see, this glorious revolution of 1688 came against James II. And James was going the way of Charles and John and Henry before him, engaging in taxation, trying to manipulate the churches and rule the churches by placing bishops in the church that were loyal to him to collect taxes. He was trying to change English common law into Roman foreign law. He was trying to take the land away from the landowners, trying again to manipulate the churches by putting his bishops in the churches to tell them how they were to run their worship services and use them to collect their taxes. He was disarming the people while the government remained armed. Listen to this. Whereas the late King James II, by the assistance of evil counselors, judges, and ministers employed by him, don't you know that kings, one man cannot be a tyrant? He's got to have evil counselors and judges and ministers and czars and regulatory agencies
Right.
to really come in and affect the people. It says, whereas the late King James II, by the assistance of evil counselors, judges, and ministers employed by him, did endeavor to subvert. We know that word now, don't we? It means to overturn and undermine. But they didn't stop there, because I think they wanted to make what was going on perfectly clear. They said, did endeavor to subvert and extirpate the Protestant religion and the laws and liberties of this kingdom. That word extirpate means to completely destroy. If you completely destroy something, is there anything left? Because it's completely destroyed, right? They were trying to make it perfectly clear this king was destroying completely liberty. Listen to what he was doing. By assuming and exercising a power of dispensing with and suspending laws and the execution of laws without the consent of Parliament. Writing laws, overturning laws, setting aside laws as the executive branch when he did not have the legislative power to do it. I just have to say two words to you. Executive orders.
Right.
How about the Department of Justice? That's an executive, it's like an oxymoron, isn't it?
Yeah.
That is an executive branch agency, and they've just flat out decided which laws they will enforce and which they won't. Isn't that the same as setting aside a law?
Yes.
Or how about a president saying, oh, well, if you don't like my federal laws, if you pay me enough money, I'll give you a waiver.
Right.
Is it the same as overturning a law for segments of people? And yet in 1689, the English people said that was a tool to completely destroy liberty. The list goes on. Creating agencies with mock courts, much like our administrative agencies, much like the EPA. All our regulatory agencies have their own separate court systems that play by their own set of rules with judges that are employed by them and completely outside the process of due process in an attempt to completely destroy liberty. Taking the arms by disarming, by causing several good subjects to be disarmed at the same time when the government was still armed. Completely destroy liberty. And when our founding fathers had in their hand this Bill of Rights of 1689, as a result of the Grand Remonstrance of 1641, which was birthed from the Petition of Right of 1628, they were all list of grievances of how the king had violated the Magna Carta, and the only reason we had a Magna Carta is because one day Henry I wanted to be king and said, okay, you accept me and I promise we will no longer be evil and oppressive. And so when George started going the same way as James, the same way as Charles, the same way as John, and the same way as Henry, a ragtag bunch of revolutionaries, literally 9% of an entire population, overthrew the most powerful government on the planet. Do you see the value in robbing us of that history? Because what we miss is not just the power that we have when we stand for liberty, but the guarantee that every single time throughout 700 years of history we stood for liberty, we always won. Always won, and won big. Each time, greater protections, from a promise to a guidelines to guarantees to the greatest human rights statements ever written on this planet in the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution of the United States, in spite of what Justice Ginsburg might think about them. See, our Constitution is not 234 years old. Our Constitution is closer to 934 years old. And it isn't that old, and that's why we should ignore it. It's that old because it's that good, and that's why we should be paying attention to it. And if I were Justice Ginsburg, I'd be a little bit more shy about discounting things because they're old. But you know, the warnings of our founding fathers are crying out to us because they had that lamp of experience. How many of you have heard the saying that those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat it? Yes. So that's only half the story. Because remember, Patrick Henry said, "I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, the lamp of experience. I know no way to judge the future but by the past." You see, we will always repeat history because there is nothing new under the sun, and human nature never changes. But what our founding fathers were trying to do with over 700 years of experience, that bright lamp that lit their path, was trying to prevent us from repeating the mistakes that their fathers made, giving us a better chance forward. Listen. John Adams said in 1797, this is his inaugural address, "If our government is negligent of its limitations," you see, the federal government was supposed to have powers that were few and defined, right? Correct. John Adams went on to say, war, peace, negotiations, and foreign commerce, period. They said primarily objects of external nature. Everything else belonged to the people to be protected by the states. Negligent of its limitations, doing something beyond its original designated, let me say that again. Delegated power. Read the 10th Amendment. You see, sometimes I get ahead of myself because I teach a whole seminar, an entire 5-hour seminar that does this history, the Bill of Rights 1 through 10, and the 17th Amendment, where we really lost it all. And so what I need you to do sometime is read that 10th Amendment. Because the 10th Amendment says the powers delegated to the United States. Not relinquished, not given, not granted, but delegated. And when a supervisor delegates the authority to a subordinate, does he ever give away that authority? No. He still has a responsibility to maintain that authority. He's just delegated so somebody else can help with it. Delegated. The powers delegated. So when they violate that, if our government is negligent of its limitations, inattentive to its people's recommendations, and disobedient to its authority. Now that authority is not the same authority that a police officer holds. What he's talking about is the separation of powers. You see, we have a separation of powers that incorporates a blending for checks and balances. We have 3 distinct branches of government, but they blend for checks and balances, which means separation of powers is a 2-edged coin. What I mean by that is the president does not have the right to write laws because that is the legislative's authority, right? When he does that, he violates separation of powers. When he makes appointments and ignores the Congress's authority, he's violating the separation of powers. But remember, it's a two-edged coin because of the checks and balances. When the president does that, violating the separation of powers, it is now the responsibility, the duty, the obligation of Congress to make him accountable and slap him back for it.
Yes.
So when our government is negligent of its authority is when not only the president steals legislative power, but when Congress sits on their hands, neutered, and does nothing about it.
Right.
It's the whole body. The House starts the impeachment process. And I've heard so many House members, when I've asked them about this, why don't you impeach? Well, because we don't have enough votes in the Senate. They would not do anything. You know what my response is? I did not elect you to speculate on what the Senate was going to do. I elected you to do your job as you're supposed to do. If I sit in a job with a cubicle and my boss comes to me and says, why aren't you doing your job, KrisAnne? And I say, well, the guy next to me is not doing his job, so why should I do mine? How long am I going to keep my job? So listen. If the government is negligent of its limitations, inattentive to its people's recommendations, and disobedient to its authority, it is destined for some serious consequences. You will see a universal languor among the people. That means a great, overwhelming apathy. Oh, it doesn't matter. My voice doesn't count. No matter what I do, they don't listen anyway. We will discourage our necessary manufactures. You won't be able to do what you need to do to make your nation prosperous. You won't mine for coal or natural gas. You won't drill for oil. And eventually, as Thomas Jefferson pointed out, you won't even plant your corn unless the government tells you when and where you can do it. You will see a universal fall in the value of lands and their produce. Contempt of the public and private faith. That has nothing to do with our belief in God. That has to do with our faith in our monetary system. He's saying that when the government becomes corrupt, your economy will collapse because the people will not even have confidence in their own dollar. You will see a loss of consideration of credit with foreign nations. I don't suppose there was an S&P negative credit rating in 1797, but he's talking about that, isn't he?
Yeah.
And at lengths of discontent, animosities, insurrections, threatening some great national calamity. Haven't we seen our share of insurrections occupy what? And I bet we haven't seen the last of them. If corruption is to overcome our government and can be influenced by foreign nations, by flattery, money, grants, promises, or menaces, fraud or violence, terror or intrigue, the government may not be the choice of the American people, but of foreign nations. It may be foreign nations that govern us, and not we, the people, who govern ourselves. Do you realize that when Benjamin Franklin warned us that anyone who would trade would trade liberty for a little temporary security will soon have neither? He was talking about what John Adams was saying right there. Because do you realize that when you allow someone to trade an inherent right, when you trade your inherent rights to feel safe, those people that scare you are your rulers. And you will never trade just a little bit of liberty. That's like saying you're just a little bit pregnant. You either trade it all or you keep it all. Because when you trade a little bit for that boogeyman, there's always a bigger one around the corner that's going to need more and more and more. That's just the way the government works. He said if we are going to have a free Republican government, we must have an attachment to the Constitution and a conscientious determination to support it. I could not have an attachment to my husband if I just carried his biography around in my back pocket and read it every now and again. I am greatly encouraged that we have pocket constitutions, but I need to tell you, because I'm big on personal responsibility here, reading it is not enough. You have to know why you have it. You have to know the sacrifice it took to get it, so that you will be able to understand the sacrifice it will take to keep it. You see, we all woke up taxed enough already. But we've got to evolve now. Because if we can honestly say we do not trust the government with our pocketbook, we must advance to the level where we can say we do not trust the government with our liberty either.
Right.
This is where we need to be. This is the awakening that has to happen among us. And we have the power to do it. You see, this is the call of our generation now. To pledge life and fortune and sacred honor for liberty. Daniel Webster said that hold on to the Constitution and to the Republic for which it stands. Miracles do not cluster, and what has happened once in 6,000 years may never happen again. Hold on to the Constitution, for if the American Constitution should fail, there will be anarchy throughout the world. Didn't Ronald Reagan say we were that shining city on the hill, the last bastion of hope?
Yes.
He was not talking about us. He was talking about what Daniel Webster said, the world. We have an obligation, not only to ourselves, but to the world. Because if we lose liberty here, where will it be? It will be here. And that'll be the only place that you'll be able to see it. See, we have got to come to the ultimate understanding that this is the last stand. And that liberty is worth it. That this is the last stand. And America is worth it. Are we not the greatest nation on this planet? Do you believe in American exceptionalism? Well, I understand from a human nature perspective how intangible those things may be. Liberty. I had a reporter from New York come up to me and say, you know, I really appreciate how passionate you guys are, but I don't understand how you get so worked up over an idea. And you know, that's what. Good thing I didn't have a table in front of me, because I would have had one of those forehead hits table moments. And I said, see, that's where you miss it, because it's not an idea. I said, the people that built this nation pledged their lives, their fortune, their sacred honor. You don't give everything for an idea. It's a God-given thing. And I understand that liberty can be sort of intangible. I can even understand the idea of American exceptionalism being intangible because we've been so far removed from it. Remember, we were just told not long ago that we're no different from Greece and Italy and Spain. So I want to impress upon you something, the very motivation that woke me up to say that my rights are more important than a paycheck. You see, I believe that liberty's worth it. I believe America's worth it. I'm a veteran. I pledged all of that. I get it. But the problem is, the real issue is, our children are worth it. And if we do not do something now, one of our greatest founding mothers, Mercy Otis Warren, said that if we do not stand for liberty today, our children will bow to tyranny tomorrow. We are that close, ladies and gentlemen, and it is all about them. So I'm just asking you, find your place. We are a body in this. We all can't be a hand. We all can't be a foot. Not everybody's meant to stand up and teach, but everybody is meant to do something. Find what your fire is and then make it your life. That's how you pledge your life today. You don't have to pick up a musket. You can say, I'm going to rescue my child from a public school system that says America is not exceptional, that God has no place in government, and that we need to raise our children in a school system that is a parent-free zone so they can be raised by the government. You can say, I'm a grandparent. I will help my children do that. I will homeschool my child. Because if we don't teach them the truth, then that idea that America is no different than Spain and Italy and Greece will become a fact. Because that's what they're being taught. So how many of you learned something here today? How many of you can think of at least one other person that you think should have been sitting here today? How many of you wish that your legislators could hear this presentation? Now let me ask you, I just want to make this offer because I don't charge anything for the full 5-hour seminar either. This time went by fairly quickly, and I can promise you the seminar goes that way too. Get with your leaders. If you want me to come back and teach the seminar, I will come back and teach it. I don't need 5,000. This is a good sized group. So if you want me to come back and teach the seminar, I will definitely come back. If you want an easy way to learn this information and share it, I have books and DVDs back there. If you want to be instrumental in rescuing your children, I have children's books. They're not picture books with words. They're word books with pictures designed to be a tool to reprogram and teach your children that America is still exceptional, that tyranny is the enemy, and that liberty is something that needs to be fought for. And I want to thank you so much, Karina, for coming. My husband can help you back there with the books. And I don't know if we have time for questions, but if we have time for questions, we can even do question and answer. Thank you so much for your support. Hey, let me forget. Yeah, thank you. Let me forget. I have a website. It's my name, KrisAnneHall.com. KrisAnneHall.com. Go to my website and do me a favor. If you're on Facebook, go to my professional page and like it. Because I'm really trying to make a difference in Tallahassee, and the politicians won't talk to me unless I have a lot of friends on Facebook, okay? Because I'm just not important enough for them. So you can help me make a difference. So I appreciate you. Pray for us, please. Do you realize that this is a spiritual battle and people hate what we're doing? I need you to pray for us. If that is the only way you're able to pray, support us, that is the best way you're able to support us. Thank you very much.